And Gillian's going to be talking about extrinsic mortality risk and socioeconomic differences in health behavior, observational and experimental evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about some work that I did with Professor Daniel Nettle at Newcastle University as part of my doctorate. I will cover some theory, a survey, and 3 experiments in 15 minutes, so I'm not going to have a large amount of time to go into detail on the methods. If you have any questions, please talk to me or refer to the publications cited on the slides. So there are marked socioeconomic inequalities in life expectancy, even in welfare states. And in my hometown of Newcastle upon Tyne, men in the most deprived neighbourhoods can expect to live on average 14 years fewer than men in the least deprived neighbourhoods. For women, this difference is around 11 years. And differences in health behaviour are thought to contribute to up to half of this gradient, sometimes more depending on what literature you look at. In fact, the leading causes of death in the US in the year 2000 were tobacco use, with 435,000 deaths attributed to it. That's around 18% of total US mortality that year. Poor diet and physical activity was given 400,000 deaths credited to it, around 17% of total mortality. And alcohol use at 85,000, around 4%. Now, some people argue that the poor have poorer health behaviours because they cannot afford to purchase healthier options. However, in the case of diet, this might be true, where a higher quality diet may be more expensive. But 2 of the 3 behaviours we're looking at here, the leading sources of mortality, the more financially costly option, consumption, is also the least healthy one. So that argument doesn't really stand up. And it means that one of the long-standing conundrums of public health is why those people who face the most adverse socioeconomic circumstances are also the people who do themselves a disservice with unhealthy behaviour and compound their situation. And I believe that an evolutionary approach can help us to understand why this might be. Because this is an evolutionary conference, I suspect many of you are familiar with disposable Soma theory, but in case you're not, I'm going to outline it briefly here and then explain why it's relevant for health behaviour. So disposable Soma theory is about the evolution of aging, and it posits that organisms should optimise their allocation of metabolic resources between growth, reproduction, and somatic maintenance. Investments made in somatic repair cannot be used for reproduction, so there's a trade-off. In addition, somatic investment cannot prevent death due to extrinsic causes, so things like predation or natural disaster, for example. And this means that the higher the rate of extrinsic mortality, the more somatic investment is wasted by not being used for reproduction. Thus, perfect repair is not selected for, and aging will evolve. Now, what has this got to do with health behaviour? Disposable Soma theory explains the evolution of aging over generations. But if we make the assumption that natural selection has endowed us with the ability to calibrate our somatic investments in response to cues from our environment, then extrinsic mortality risk should affect our behavioural investments in health. Daniel Nettle did a very interesting theoretical model on this, where he made the explicit distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic causes of mortality for behaviour. So he explained that intrinsic mortality risks are those that can be reduced by behavioural change, and these include classic health behaviours like the ones on my earlier slide. But then he also defined extrinsic, the uncontrollable things that actually, regardless of your behaviour, you cannot avoid. Now, you may be wondering, what does this have to do with socioeconomic status and health behaviour? Oh, also, I should point out that I think this distinction is really useful and needs to be made more often, because to say that your mortality risk affects your health behaviour is quite circular. But to make this distinction takes out the circularity, because you're saying it is only the mortality risk that you can do nothing about that should affect your health behaviour. And I think this cartoon conveys the point really nicely. If you expect to die at any moment due to something you can do relatively little about, you're unlikely to worry about the future consequences of lighting that pipe. And this might seem quite extreme, and you may be thinking, well, what does this tell us about socioeconomic differences in health behavior? Well, the truth is that there are known socioeconomic inequalities in a range of exposure to hazards. These things include air pollution, poor housing, violent crime, and a range of other things as you see listed here. And the interesting thing is that if you're lower socioeconomic status, you do have less control over this. You're less likely to be able to afford to live in a better neighborhood where there's less pollution or less crime. And if you're less educated, you're probably less likely to be able to get a job that is in a safer environment. As you can see here, I've used an inspiration from the British news, which found that a large proportion of local building sites were deemed unsafe. So the manual workers, who are by definition lower socioeconomic status, who work there, are exposed to more hazards. So cumulatively, these things might add up to mean that there are quite meaningful and potentially quite visible differences in socioeconomic investment in health. My first test of this hypothesis was a simple survey. I surveyed 600 US respondents via Social Sci, who kindly agreed to give me free access to these participants. And what I found was that the lower SES participants felt that they had less control over their mortality risk. In fact, they reported that each incremental extra piece of effort that they could put into their health, they thought would do relatively little to extend their life expectancy. I also found that these same people, unsurprisingly, reported investing less effort in looking after their health. Indeed, perceived extrinsic mortality risk was a full mediator of the relationship between socioeconomic status and health behavior in this data set. And just to really ram it home, this is a little cheeky, but what I'm doing is I'm showing the effect sizes in the main model in terms of area on the screen. So the diameter of that circle represents the effect size of age, and it's minute. Sex has a slightly larger effect size, but still negligible. SES and income don't even register as circles on our screen. Their perception of intrinsic mortality risk is larger, but still small. By comparison, perceived extrinsic mortality risk has an effect that won't even fit on this screen. But this is just survey data. It was in an opportunity sample. It was correlational, cross-sectional, and I wanted to look at causality. So I ran some experiments. I used false life expectancy calculators for the first two experiments. People were asked to enter their age, their gender, and their postal code. Were given a processing screen telling them that their data was being matched to those of a similar demographic from throughout the UK. They were then given a result, which was randomly allocated to them. The result either told them, I'm afraid you might not be able to read it very well, but in the extrinsic conditions that people like them, of their demographic, were dying due to causes beyond individual control, and in the example here it says such as traffic accidents and air pollution. In the intrinsic condition, it said that people like them were dying due to individual health behaviours. We then asked them to go on and fill out a survey, and at the end we thanked them for taking part, and we offered them a choice of reward for taking part in the study. We asked them if they wanted a box of chocolates, our unhealthy option, or if they wanted a box of organic fruits, our healthy option. I should say before we move on that these people were all fully debriefed. Don't worry, nobody went away thinking that they had a high uncontrollable risk of mortality. We did tell them at the end that this was a manipulation. And I don't have time to go into great detail regarding the experimental conditions, but this is what happened. And the key thing to note is that in the conditions where we made the prevailing mortality risk for people like them seem to be controllable ones, we see an increase in people taking fruit. In fact, on the left here, what we have is an 84% relative increase in the number of people choosing fruit when they were made to feel that prevailing mortality risks were controllable. On the second study, on the right there, we have a minimum 47% relative increase in people taking fruit. Now, I should say on the right that there are more experimental conditions there because we did a control condition to find out what the baseline preference would be, but we also separated out the effects of expecting to live a longer or shorter life from the effects of the controllability of the cause of mortality. And I should say that it is the controllability of the cause of mortality that matters here, not whether you tell someone they're going to live a long or a short time. But those first studies that I've just shown you were explicitly a health-related study. So people knew they were taking part in an experiment and they knew it was health-related. And I wanted to find out whether or not this effect would hold when people were unaware that they were taking part in a study that was related to health. So I spent 50 long hours of my life stood in a shopping centre in the Newcastle-on-Tyne area, enticing shoppers to take part in a prize draw. The main prize was £300 in shopping vouchers for the centre. And what I asked people to do was to come and fill out a polling card which asked them why they thought people in the area were now living longer. In the intrinsic condition, we said there were reasons such as people having more control over the kind of healthcare they receive, people taking care of themselves better, or both. Those were those options. In the extrinsic condition, the reasons listed were reductions in traffic accidents, reductions in violent crime, or both. And we hope that by seeing these options listed, that would imply that these were the causes of death locally. Now, quite predictably, I then asked them to choose the bonus prize that they would prefer to win, and the choice was between fruit and chocolate again. Now, the result was similar to those in the other experiments. We saw a 54% relative increase in people choosing fruit when controllable mortality risks were mentioned. There was an overall lower preference for fruit, and I think there may be a few reasons for this. One was that the demographic of the people in the shopping centre was lower socioeconomic status than the participants in the other experiments. But the other is actually that it was quite an uncontrolled environment. It was coming up to Christmas, and interestingly, a lot of people who were there, it was end of November, were doing their Christmas shopping, and they said to me, "Oh, I would choose fruit for myself, but I think chocolate would make a great Christmas gift for someone." But still, we see a similar result. And so the evidence I have so far supports the hypothesis that extrinsic mortality risk may be important for health behaviour. But why does that matter? Why is it important? For one thing, it can help to explain the paradox of persistent health inequalities in welfare states. It can be that small initial inequalities in exposure to extrinsic mortality risks affect health behaviour, which exacerbates the problem, leading to larger overall inequalities. Now, if this is the case, we can expect there to be a twofold effect, which means that if we were to tackle extrinsic mortality, we might improve health behaviours and therefore reduce overall inequalities. Another important point that this perspective gives us is that unhealthy behaviours may in fact be a logical response to exposure to extrinsic mortality risk, rather than being due to whim or ignorance, as is often assumed. And I think that's very important because there's a lot of stigma around some behaviours. There's also the possibility that perceptions of extrinsic mortality risk might be skewed, for example, by media scare stories or media portrayals of violence. If this is the case, then just adjusting perceptions to make them more accurate might in fact improve health behaviour. And an intriguing possibility for me as a behavioural scientist is that this may not be limited to health behaviour. In fact, it may be limited to any behaviour in which you have to invest something in the present in order to see an outcome in the future. So financial behaviour, for example. And indeed, we know extrinsic mortality risk is related to people's reproductive timing, such that they reproduce sooner, and that's all part of life history theory. Finally, I think there's a really important possibility, which is that unhealthy behaviour may in fact mirror physiological disinvestment in health, such that we have a combination of accelerated ageing and unhealthy behaviour, leading to differential ageing by socioeconomic status. I'd like to thank Daniel Nettle for his collaboration and inspiration on this work, the Newcastle University Institute of Neuroscience for funding me, Social Sci for giving me all the free data I mentioned, and you for listening.